The fallout now, because we already know that in Alberta there's talk of possible retaliation. We know Jason Kenney, who is running for the leadership of the United Conservative Party of Alberta, has already told the Globe that, hey, if the government of BC is going to purposely undermine the rule of law and try to stop them from sending oil down this pipeline, then there will be repercussions. And this is what Green Party leader Andrew Weaver had to say about that.
He sounded a bit like Donald Trump threatening Kim in, North Korea with his kind of chest pounding. The reality is, why doesn't Alberta refine its product there?
How topical.
Why aren't they doing that?
Let's bring in Jason Kenney, who's on the line. Hi, Jason.
Hi there.
Okay, what did you think about what Andrew Weaver had to say?
Well, Mr. Weaver, I think, is undermining the economic interests of Canada and British Columbia. And the rule of law. This isn't just about a pipeline. It's about whether Canada's a country governed by laws and whether or not we are an economic union. We're celebrating the 150th anniversary of Confederation, the key idea of which was that we are one big economic union. We trade our goods and services between each other without barriers. That's supposed to be how Canada operates. Of course, the federal government has a responsibility for regulating pipelines. Under the Constitution, it has the most exhaustive consultation and approval process in the world for pipelines. The National Energy Board went through over 2 years of exhaustive consultations, expert scientific analysis, consultations with all of the affected communities and Aboriginal groups, and approved this pipeline, as did the federal cabinet, which is represented by a majority of MPs from British Columbia in the federal Liberal government. So the decision has been made, and now it has to proceed because, people need to understand, Andrew Weaver needs to understand, there already is the Kinder Morgan pipeline. It's existed for 6 decades. Without it, the Lower Mainland would grind to a halt overnight. This is simply an effort to expand that capacity so that instead of importing foreign oil into BC, like through Alaska, we can be energy self-sufficient in Canada.
Now, you threatened possible retaliation if you were the leader, if you were the Premier of Alberta. Like what?
Well, there's a whole lot of... Look, I wouldn't want to leave all of our options open. Right now, as you know, there's an NDP government here. We hope that they will be replaced by a Conservative government in 2019. And in advance of that, I would have every possible option on the table. I'll remind you of this. Back in the early 1980s, when the federal Liberal government brought in the National Energy Program that really hammered Alberta's energy industry, Peter Lougheed, who was then the Premier, he basically held back permits which restricted the flow of Alberta oil to central Canada. And that's the kind of thing that Alberta governments have done in the past. Alberta buys a lot of hydroelectricity from British Columbia. There's a huge amount of BC exports that have to pass through Alberta. There are various legal... Obviously, we would take a very big stance against any obstruction by the BC government to the free flow of trade in goods and services. So there's a whole lot of options that we would put on the table. But here's the bottom line. We would not allow another provincial government to undermine the rule of law, to create arbitrary trade barriers for an authorized pipeline without repercussions, without response.
Jason, one of the questions around this as well, especially from some in British Columbia, is the environmental impact if this diluted bitumen ever was to, say, leach into English Bay or something along those lines, because there's not really a way to clean that up. So at what stage does the environment take consideration over economics?
At the regulatory stage. That's exactly what the National Energy Board is empowered to assess. And if the Energy Board found that there was any meaningful risk of that kind of environmental damage, then they wouldn't have approved this. But listen, the National Energy Board is not an environmental organization out there trying to raise money by creating public hysteria. It is a independent, quasi-judicial body that applies of any regulatory body of its nature in the world. Is calling upon expert opinion, hearing from all of the critics and opponents, balancing all the different information, and they approved this pipeline, as did the federal cabinet, because they don't believe that that there are serious environmental risks. I'll remind you that Kinder Morgan TransMountain pipeline has been operating for over 6 decades, fueling the economy of British Columbia, especially the Lower Mainland, without a single significant environmental incident in 6 decades, which, by the way, is one of the reasons that the vast majority of Aboriginal communities along the pipeline route have approved it, have endorsed it. Those communities deserve a voice at least as much as the small number who are opposed to it.
What about Andrew Weaver's comment saying, why doesn't Alberta just refine the product in Alberta?
Well, we do refine a lot of products in Alberta. In fact, a lot of the hydrocarbon-based energy that comes down the TransMountain pipeline currently to Burnaby to fuel much of the economy in the Lower Mainland in Alberta and in Edmonton, but they can also export raw product. And at the end of the day, I know Andrew Weaver has zero experience in job creation or business or investment, but governments don't refine what companies do, and it takes at least $10 billion to build a modern oil refinery, and there's no market basis for that kind of capital investment in Alberta right now because there's excess refining capacity in North America as it is.
So what happens if this drags on and on and on in the courts for years and TransMountain just says we're done and gives up?
Well, then we're going to end up as a country that's choosing poverty over prosperity. We just, as you know, British Columbia just lost the largest ever proposed direct foreign investment in Canadian economic history, the $36 billion Petronas LNG pipeline project that would have created thousands of jobs, sustainable, good-paying jobs in British Columbia, would have lifted a lot of our First Nations communities from poverty to prosperity, and it's been shut down partly because of delays of this nature. So we as a country need to decide, our history is proudly, I would say, a country that develops our resources. And by the way, Canada regardless of what Andrew Weaver would like, the world is not fueled by pixie dust or dilithium crystals. There is a growing projected demand for hydrocarbon-based energy. So we have a choice as a country. Either Canada, with the highest environmental, human rights, and labor standards, a major oil and gas producer in the world, helps to satisfy much of that demand, or we abandon global energy markets to kleptocracies, dictatorships, and theocracies like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Venezuela and Iran. I would prefer that Canada, with our high environmental and human rights and labor standards, be a major player in those markets, and that we have the capacity to pay for our health care, pensions, and education in the future by the environmentally responsible development of these resources.
Jason, final question for you. You currently don't hold elected office. You're not the leader of your party. Why should British Columbians listen to you?
Because it's almost certain that there will be a united Conservative government in Alberta in 2019. The Alberta and BC economies are largely integrated. We should be partners in the economic union that is Canada. We shouldn't allow politicians to become barriers to our prosperity or create friction between these two great Canadian provinces.
All right, Jason Kenney, thanks for your time today.
My pleasure. Thanks very much, guys.
Thanks, Jason. Appreciate it.